Well, welcome. This is a pre-recorded portion of our clergy conference because we wanted to have an opportunity to share with you insights from our experience at Lambeth with the Reverend Canon Chuck Robertson, who is a part of the presiding bishop's staff. And he is, as you probably know, the canon for mission beyond the Episcopal Church in the wider Anglican communion. I might not have gotten your specific title exactly right, Chuck, but we are so appreciative of the way that you nurture partnerships both within the communion and ecumenically worldwide in our ministry in the Episcopal Church. And you were such an important part of the Lambeth Conference, not only the conference itself in England this summer, but the lead up to and the follow through as well. They've talked about it in 3 phases. So we're now in phase 3, and we're really glad to have you join us and to have your perspective, insight, and input around our experience at Lambeth and what comes afterwards. So thanks for joining us and for being a part of the conversation.
Well, Bishop, thank you. Thank you both, bishops, for this opportunity. And thanks to all of you who will be watching this in the Diocese of North Carolina, a place that is near and dear to my heart, and certainly near and dear to the heart of my boss. And I give you greetings from Presiding Bishop Michael Curry as well. Yes, I head up the team that looks at ministry beyond the Episcopal Church. That includes, by the way, also our Office of Government Relations, Episcopal Migration Ministries and our work with refugees, our ecumenical and interreligious relations, and of course, as you said, our global relations throughout the Anglican Communion. So it is great to be with you all today.
Thanks. And Bishop Ann's going to lead us through some conversation and questions around some of the areas that were the focus at the Lambeth Conference.
Excellent.
Great. So thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Bishop Sam. So our first conversation is going to be around the Lambeth Call on discipleship. And we've discussed previously that Lambeth Call process. So we're going to kind of dive right in. We're using 3 examples among, I think there were 10 calls. But discipleship is something clearly near and dear to the heart of the Episcopal Church, to the Diocese of North Carolina. To see it elevated at the Lambeth Conference made perfect sense. How do we shape disciples in ways that allow them to understand, to know, to follow, and to give witness to Jesus? How's that happening around the communion? Why is that important to the communion? So we called out a particular section of the discipleship call where we read that all Anglicans are called to learn and learn again the liberating way of Christ in every aspect of their lives with the strength that God supplies. And this section is very much about intentional discipleship making. So Chuck, I wanted to start off by asking you, who follows our bishop, who talks a lot about following disciples and making disciples who make a difference as he goes around the globe. What are you noticing in other parts of the communion around intentional discipleship making? What we heard several speakers refer to as the Jesus-shaped life. What did you notice? What did you hear? How did it land?
Absolutely. And let me talk in both time and space. So time machine back, all the way back to the beginnings of the Lambeth Conference, this was a big piece in there. From the beginning, there was talks about how to cooperate with each other. We've struggled with that ever since, as we do as human beings. But from the beginning, there was a focus on what we now would call a Jesus-shaped life. The second Archbishop to host a Lambeth Conference, Archbishop Archibald Tate, who hosted the second Lambeth Conference way back in the 1870s, he said, this is not about doctrine or discipline or defining this or kicking out that person or disagreeing. He said, and I love this line, I think it should be a work of love in which we are engaged. That is the extension of Christ's kingdom. From the beginning, this idea of living out a life the way we see in Jesus of Nazareth. And in fact, it's fascinating to me to see that some of the words that our own presiding bishop uses a lot in talking about that kind of unselfish, intentional love really was a part of some of the earliest conversations. Now, moving up into time, into our own time, I will tell you that leading up to this conference, in every visit I make throughout the communion, pre-COVID and now post-COVID, what I continue to hear again and again has been a cry for how do we help shape disciples more? I hear a lot about folks in every single part of the community. The number one thing I hear about is the need for greater education and formation of leaders as well as disciples, to be disciples, but also to be disciple makers. And so I hear that. How do we help strengthen and enhance clergy leadership? How do we strengthen and enhance lay leadership? And in fact, one of the most moving moments I had was in January of 2015, when a group of different primates or archbishops from different parts of Africa came to New York to meet with then presiding Bishop Catherine Jefferts Schori and myself. And in that, they opened by saying, we know that we all have different positions on issues of sexuality. They said, but we're tired of being bullied by certain persons on our continent into not being in a relationship with you. The number one thing we are called to do together is to help people learn of the love of Christ, the love of God, and to help make disciples. I'll never forget that. It was a moment that said that is our call. And I'm seeing this, whether it's in Latin America and the Caribbean, whether it is in Africa, whether it is in Asia and the Pacific, whether it is in the British Isles. Everywhere I go, this is a central theme, and folks are working on this.
Thank you. I feel like I felt that spirit myself as I had conversations with other bishops. Bishop Sam, I'm wondering if you wanted to comment on I know for you that the phrase "a Jesus-shaped life" really resonated, and I wondered if where you felt and saw that in terms of discipleship, that being more intentional about that in Lambeth, and then what you kind of feel like you want to bring back to the diocese about that.
Sure. Thank you, Bishop Ann. And thank you, Chuck, just for the story, the focus, and the history, because that really is consistent with the experience that I had at Lambeth, that we had at Lambeth, that there was something that was calling us together that allowed us not to ignore our differences or our disagreements, but to live into the fellowship and the call as siblings in Christ and siblings in the family of God, to really understand what does discipleship look like in the 21st century. And the theme of love that our presiding bishop has been so articulate in lifting up was very much running through the Bible studies that we shared on 1 Peter, but also resonant in the stories that were shared from the wider communion. And I'm thinking in particular of Bishop Eleanor Sanderson, who has been in New Zealand. I think she's now relocating to a diocese in England, but she talked about their experience of forming intentional communities and how that was really built around the Jesus-shaped life. And for me, there's both an individual and a corporate or community component to that phrase, Jesus-shaped life. On the one hand, all of us on our journey of faith are trying to build up our understanding and our relationship with Jesus and the call and what that looks like and feels like, in terms of following in the way of love, following those footsteps, using those 7 practices that Bishop Curry and his staff have lifted up for us about what that means. But it's not just what it means for us as individuals. What does it mean for us as part of a congregation, part of a community? In New Zealand, it was forming intentional communities because to a large extent, the structure of the institutional church has broken apart in the ways that we've traditionally experienced it. And they're really finding this intentional community model as a way of opening new pathways to the Jesus-shaped life. And for me, the phrase resonated with something Bishop Curry has talked about, in part in response to things happening in our context here in the States, around what will it mean to be a church that looks more like Jesus. So there's the individual disciple that lives a Jesus-shaped life, but there's a church that looks more like Jesus. And that's what we're called to become in the 21st century church. And a church that looks like Jesus has elements of what Bishop Eleanor Sanderson shared with us in that intentional community experience of the folks in New Zealand, where they were living together in Christian community. So very much more like the early church model, but all of their working life was engaged in the world and in the needs and the concerns of the community around them. And yet they would come together for spiritual support, for strength, for prayer, for worship, for Bible study. And many of them actually left places they'd been living and came with their families to be a part of this community. That's a kind of radical immersion in community that we don't see in practice here, but it is invitational as we imagine what we may be called to in the wider church over time, and certainly a powerful illustration from the wider communion. So that's just one example for me about what it might look like to live a Jesus-shaped life or a Jesus-centered life. And I'm really excited to hear more about the new curriculum that the Episcopal Church is now is just released on the centered life as part of that call to discipleship.
Absolutely, Bishop. And the exciting thing is, as Anglicans, it is in our DNA to understand that as we address such a question, what does it mean to live a Jesus-shaped life? What does it mean to be centered? To do that in our own context. So the context, not only globally, but even in the Diocese of North Carolina, each one of your churches has a special gift, a special calling, and a special context. And so the beauty is we don't have to reinvent the wheel in every single place. We can also lift up in prayer and support each other to do slightly different ways of living into this. And that's really been part of our DNA from the days that Augustine was first sent by Pope Gregory the Great to the shores of Kent in the southeast part of England. And he went and said, "Oh, I found Christians already here, but they're not the right kind." And Gregory wrote back and said, "Hang on there, relax. It's okay. Find out what God is doing in that place, in that context, and take what you've brought with you as well, and somehow find a way to see how that fits in that unique context." I think that contextualizing is so important. Every one of your congregations, your parishes, missions, your chaplaincies, every one will have a slight different variation of what it means to live out that centered life, that Jesus-shaped life. And to me, that's one of the wonderful things that we saw at Lambeth, and that I have seen at each of the Lambeth conferences I've been, despite the differences, or maybe because of them. And in fact, one last thing from 1920, 102 years ago, the bishops gathered together for the Lambeth Conference said, "It is not by reducing the different groups of Christians to uniformity, but rather by rightly using their diversity that the church can become all things to all people." Now, that was 100 years ago. And that's language that is as relevant now, if not more so, in the 21st century as it was then. So yes, I welcome seeing the different ways in which this will be lived out.
We're going to turn in just a couple of minutes to some small group discussions on intentionally Christian-shaped lives, intentional Christian communities, and Jesus-shaped lives. So a final word that I would like to put to this, it brings me back to wondering what we can learn from existing intentional Christian communities, especially our Episcopal Service Corps, which are usually by design, which are often very reluctant, depending on the location and the context, to talk about Jesus, right? And yet shape themselves in ways that open themselves to the Spirit. And I wonder what they have to teach worship communities who are comfortable talking about Jesus, but not so sure they know how to shape intentional daily lives of service in conversation with community that then transforms your vision for service. And so it says to me, we can come back one wondering about what it looks like for our worship communities to consider themselves not just formation by liturgy, but formation by living. Sometimes we talk a lot about how the liturgy shapes us. Clearly, although sometimes implicitly, could we learn from our intentional Christian communities like Johnson Service Corps and other Episcopal Service Corps, what it's like to then embody that in some very daily practices in our work lives. So I think there's more conversation. And Chuck, maybe we can look forward to hearing from you and the folks who work on global partnerships. I think something North Carolina would love to hear more about is where people are living in intentional Christian communities to shape a new generation of disciples who maybe weren't that comfortable with the way grandmother was doing church, but would like to find a Jesus-shaped life in community. We could probably learn a lot about that among our global partners in the Anglican Communion.
I think that'd be wonderful. And David Copley, the Reverend David Copley and his team in global partnerships and mission personnel would love to do that. Even now, I've been doing emails early this morning, back and forth with some from Asia, some from Africa, and some from Latin America and the Caribbean. There is a lot going on in a lot of different places that we could learn from and recognize that that we would live it out in our own context.
Well, we'll get to follow up that some more with our other two conversations, but we'll pause there for now. Thanks, Bishop Sam. Thank you, Chuck.
Thank
you, Bishop Ann.